war on terror for several years now. Um, this is the 16th year of Guantanamo being used that way. There's 41 people still detained at Guantanamo in addition to the separate military tribunal. Um, and that's the same number that were there when the prison was turned over to the Trump administration from the Obama administration. The 41 people, some of them approved for transfer who simply did not make it before Trump took over the administration. So we're here to discuss both the status of Guantanamo in its 16th year, in its first year under the Trump administration, as well as the general future of American detention policy in the coming years. To talk about this, we have Karen Greenberg, who directs the Center on National Security at Fordham, Andy Worthington, who is a co-founder of Closed Guantanamo and wrote one of the key books on the Guantanamo files, and Thomas Wilner, who's a counsel with Sherman and Sterling, and also was the counsel in some of the key court cases establishing the right to habeas for Guantanamo detainees. So that's all I'll say to begin with. We'll turn it over to them to give about 5 to 8 minutes each on where Guantanamo stands today, how we got here, and their general thoughts on the future. And then I'll ask them some questions, and we'll turn it over to you for questions. So.
That looks like me.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So, well, thank you. Thank you for doing this. I want to know how many years we got to keep doing this. You know, we have to save January 11th every single year. And what makes me the most angry is people call and they say, could you come to a meeting on something irrelevant on January 11th? I'm like, do you know that January 11th is, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about at the end today is the, I'm going to talk a little bit about what hasn't changed at Guantanamo and what I think there have been some significant changes. And we may not see them because they're not happening at Guantanamo. So I will give an overview, and then you guys can talk about all the juicy details of what's going on there. When I think about Guantanamo, and I don't mean to trivialize what's happened there over the past 16 years, but do you know this child's game, Mad Libs? You know, it's like a pad where they leave out words, and then you fill in words, and it's supposed to be, it's funny because it just says adjective or food or something like that. Guantanamo now feels to me like Mad Libs. Every single year, there are pages on the exact same thing, but you fill in the blanks. And so I thought I would make a list of what I think the repetitive happenings are at Guantanamo, so you can see what actually hasn't changed over 3 presidencies over 16 years. And maybe the first thing I would say is, I'm pointing to today's news, of course, is the issue of attorney-client privilege has been a problem since day one at Guantanamo. Whether it was, and some version of that. So being able to have your private space where you can talk to your client in the way you need to talk to your client. Whether it was the listening devices that they found years ago on the walls that were smoke detectors, whether it was the FBI informant that was found as a mole among the defense team, and there are several other issues. Now we have issues of attorney-client privilege raised by the recent event where 3 civilian defense attorneys decided to quit the case because of ethical issues. We don't know what those issues were. Some of us might, but anyway, we don't know what those issues were in the public. But we know it has something to do with attorney-client privilege. Now we see there are plans for a new facility at Guantanamo, a legal defense facility, and in it there are plans for a listening room. And the idea of this listening room is there would be some kind of monitor to make sure that nothing classified was talked about. But in other words, it's just same old, same old. It's what it was before, you just fill in the blanks. Same thing with the legacy of torture. Whether we like it or not, the legacy of torture, whether it's in civilian courts, Article III courts here in the United States, or in the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay, it makes it impossible for a number of these cases to proceed. when you talk to the Department of Justice, years ago, they tried to fight for these Guantanamo cases to come into federal court. And somehow in the past couple of years, at the very end of the Obama administration, they gave up. And they went from what Eric Holder said in 2009 when he first decided to bring the 9/11 cases here, the 9/11 case here. He said, I know we can do this. The same thing he said about a trial that did happen, that of Ahmed Gailani. Now we hear from DOJ officials, there's not enough evidence. What they mean is there's not enough evidence that isn't tainted by torture. And there are other things, but this is repeated year after year in different ways. And the defense bar exploits it for good reason to try to make a point, to delay the prosecutions. But the result is that as it was intended to do in the ban against torture, as what it means by the fruit of the poisonous tree, this is what it means. And so this cannot be tried, and it's year after year. Today, something very interesting happened, which was, and I don't know if you've read the news, but did you see this joint habeas petition that was issued today? There was a joint habeas petition issued on behalf of 12 detainees, sort of a, and something, when I say, things are same old, we've had many habeas petitions since Rasool and Boumediene. Lawyers have been fighting for the right of the detainees at Guantanamo to challenge their detention. But this is a very interesting document because it does have something somewhat new in it. Might still be a paragraph in the same habeas page. But instead of arguing about issues related to the courtroom, issues related to detention, issues to the initial detention, issues related to interrogation, and all of the things that have been argued inside these habeas petitions, they're arguing on what I think are very interesting and important grounds. One is an anti-Muslim bias, and the other is they're arguing about the, and this is sort of folded into what else is going on, this new issue of groin searches for the 9/11 defendants as they come into court. They are maintaining that this is a form of sexual harassment, if not sexual abuse. And so you now have two of the issues that are headliners in major, separate from Guantanamo, separate from anything to do with the war on terror military commissions. One is racism, and the other one is sexual impropriety. Now argued inside cases about Guantanamo. I think that's a very interesting turn in terms of what's happening that is new and different. So I urge you to go find that petition. It's maybe 20 pages. It's worth reading. Then there's the category of Guantanamo of what remains undone, which every year we have a catalog of what remains undone, and then the opposite of it is, I couldn't find the right wording for this, maybe you guys could have it, but how much of what's happened at Guantanamo has actually been reversed? So I saw today that a number of people talked about the 9 convictions at Guantanamo without mentioning the ones that have been overturned and the ones that have been vacated, right? Now we have the conviction of Al-Kozi that's being contended. What is going to remain at the end of Guantanamo? Who's actually going to stand convicted? So at the same time that Guantanamo continues and goes on and we have a repetition of things, at the same time it's unraveling its own story as it goes on. So which is going to come first? The unraveling of the complete unraveling of the military commissions, or some conviction within the military courts of any of the 9/11 detainees or al-Nashri? And I think that's a very important thing that we need to look at. And then my final page in the Mad Libs was the page, and I had many, but I kind of put this down for time, was the can you believe it category. Because every year there's things that happen at Guantanamo and you're like, that did not happen. One of them is, of course, I'm sure this is the first one that comes to your mind, is the detention in contempt of court of the Marine Brigadier General who approved the 3-lawyer defense attorney saying that they were quitting the case. But that was just sort of, what? That's the step forward that the commissions are able to take? But then the one that really gets to me and that I think highlights the unbelievability of so much of Guantanamo was the discussion about burning the art done by the detainees. I don't know how many of you have been in New York or have seen the exhibit or seen pictures. This is an amazing exhibit, by the way. When I first went, I was like, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to see. It's just going to make me so sad. I don't think I could go, right? Then I go, you should see these pictures. First of all, I don't know what colors they gave these guys, but they are beautiful. They are blue. Have you seen it?
No, not
It's
yet.
amazing.
Let's
It's
see next week.
blues and these delicious colors. And you're like, what? And you know, one of it's a flying heart. They're not hopeless in any way. And the idea that they want to burn these just they came up with a number of reasons, which I'm not going to go through, but the idea that they even that they were going to destroy these, I don't know, maybe they weren't going to burn them, that's how I read it, but is another one of those, can you believe this is what's going on? So what I really want to say is there are some things that are different. One is this habeas petition. But another thing that's different is the absence of any kind of movement for, despite this petition, for release of the prisoners. You know that Obama ratcheted up the pace at which he was, thanks to Lee Wolosky and others helping him, the pace of individuals getting out of Guantanamo. Trump brought an end to that position, the ambassador at large for the releases, so we no longer even have a person in place to do it, but there's no appetite, there's no thinking about it. And another thing that I think has changed, and maybe it hasn't changed and I'm just idealistic or blind to it, is the fact that no one cares. No one, I mean, we care, and people we know care, and the people we write to and call it care, and you guys care. But the American public does not care about this. The last time, I tried to find this, and please tell me if you know other of this. The major polls, Gallup, Pew, the CNN polls, and a couple other media polls that would monitor how do people feel about Guantanamo, should it close, should it open. The last one, and it was a single one, was 2016. There's no appetite for this, although it did come up in the election, in the campaign, Trump wanting to put bad dudes there, and even the mention that they might, open it up for Americans, which is not possible, was yet another sign that it just wasn't part of the mix. Guantanamo's securely been put in a black box on a distant island exactly as it was intended to be. And so that's, but I do think the interest is decreasing. It's not even staying the same. That's something else I would say was different. And then the final thing, and I know we're not talking about the military commissions today, but I want to say a few things about what's happening in terms of the larger world that Guantanamo belongs to, which is the world of detention, interrogation or interviewing for the purpose of intelligence, and prosecution, which are wherever you try them. There doesn't seem to be any appetite going forward for trying international, non-citizen, particularly accused of activities abroad, like Abu Khatala from Benghazi, that was just tried here recently, any appetite for detaining and bringing terrorism suspects to the United States for court. We have not seen this initiated. I don't know what's going on at NSD, but there haven't been any releases of press announcements or anything like that. And as a footnote, but an important footnote to that, under the Obama administration, largely with energy from things that had been designed in the Bush administration, the CIA, the FBI, DOJ, military, and others set up something called the HIG, which was a high-value interrogation group, I think that's what it stands for, which was an attempt to give all the equities inside the intelligence and law enforcement and military community a way of dealing with somebody who was detained. Here's the guy that we found on the battlefield in Syria. Here's what we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk to him. Then we'll decide what happens to him. When this American citizen was arrested, detained in Syria in September, and we still don't know very much about him, there was a conscious decision not to send a HIG team. And then there have been discussions, although none of them corroborated, about there isn't going to be any more HIG team. And then there were discussions about privatizing this particular part of the American approach to detention and potential trial. So what I would like to say is that it's hard to believe, but Guantanamo, because of lack of interest, because of lack of headlines, is very much looks like we're going to be here next year. And I would love not to be here, not because I don't like you guys. So those are my remarks. Your turn.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks to everybody who has turned up here. There is this Groundhog Day element to it. It just seems to get more Groundhog Day. Guantanamo Groundhog Day. Welcome. I've been coming over, you can tell from my accent that is not even inflected with any Americanisms. I don't think that I am a Brit who somehow got into the Guantanamo story 12 long years ago now it is, and I've been working on that ever since. I've been coming here in January. This is my 8th January here. hence the Groundhog Day. And New America has been so kind as to host us here every year. One year, Tom and I were so exhausted, I think it was about 2014, that we didn't do it, but we've done it every other year. And sometimes when we have other people who join us, and Karen is here this year, which is great. And we try and hope that something is going to happen with Guantanamo. And throughout all those years of President Obama, we had the feeling that although we hit some very low points, there was one point at which for a period of nearly 3 years, he sat on his hands and didn't release any prisoners, apart from ones he didn't release any voluntarily. They had either secured plea deals in military commissions or had been approved for release by the courts. He didn't want to take on the Republicans who were cynically using Guantanamo to oppose him. But those were the darkest times. Otherwise, we pushed, and everybody who cared about this, little by little, chipped away at it. And we knew that even by the end, there were some people within the administration who cared. There were other people who didn't care as much, and there were always the political discussions of people as to, is this worth it? Is this not worth it politically? But we ended up with this position where just 41 men were held. Now, that was not enough. He should have closed it. But the shocking thing nearly a year on is that Donald Trump has done nothing but seal the prison shut. Now, he hasn't fulfilled the wildest and most outrageous claims of what he wanted to do with the prison, which was to send the bad dudes there and send Americans there, and he wanted to bring back a wholesale U.S. torture program. And none of this has happened, and for very sensible reasons. It's that only when he's surrounded by the most deranged lunatic people would that be acceptable, because everybody else knows you're going to try people for crimes related to terrorism, you have to put them in federal court. Guantanamo is nothing to do with the law. It's a place that was set up to be beyond the reach of the law, where people could be tortured and abused. And, you know, over the years, the way people were treated at Guantanamo changed. Over the years, and Tom here fought battles up to the Supreme Court to get rights for those prisoners, they eventually did get habeas corpus rights. I mean, this is the ancient history lesson now, is this was in 2004. Then Congress took them away again. Then in 2008, they got constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. Then was the golden period when, for a few years, prisoners were actually released from Guantanamo because judges said to the government, you have not made a case that these people had anything to do with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And then the appeals court changed the rules. They told the lower court, you must believe everything that the government says unless you can prove it otherwise. And no prisoner has since had their habeas corpus petition granted. You can't get out of Guantanamo anymore through the law. So that door shut again. And President Obama then set up a parole-type process, the periodic review boards, to sidestep issues of how Republicans were dealing with the detention issues. To say, okay, we're going to say that if you promise to behave well when we leave here and you can present a credible case, then we'll let you go. And in the last couple of years, that led to several dozen more people being approved for release, which meant that he ended up with these 41 men. But now here we are. Donald Trump doesn't care that 5 of the 41 men held were approved for release by the 2 review processes that President Obama set up. High-level government review processes. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't seem to care about the periodic review boards, which nominally, in some sleepwalking way, are still reviewing the cases of the prisoners. But I think we all feel that it's unlikely that they're going to suggest that any of those people should be released. And then we've got the handful of people facing the broken trial system. But the key thing that we all need to know and say, is this acceptable? And if this really isn't acceptable, how do we keep pushing it? Is that because he's shut the door on it, because he doesn't want to release anybody, he's made it abundantly clear again that Guantanamo is what it always was when it started, a place where the rules don't apply, a place where the laws don't apply, a place beyond the law. You can only get out of that prison at the whim of the President of the United States. And look who is now the President of the United States that we all would have to look to see whether he would deign through his privilege to release any of these people, because the law can't help them. The law cannot release anyone from that prison. There is no end of hostilities that people normally seized in wartime would be able to say, this has happened, let me go now. There are no criminal charges that are going to be brought. So we have to find ways this year, those of us who care, to try and at least change the situation if we have to meet in a year's time. That we can't let him get away with that. And that we have to wake up the American people to an understanding that this is so unacceptable. 16 years is such a long time. My son turned 18 just before Christmas. He was 2 when Guantanamo opened. So there are teenagers in this country all around the world who have not known any other life apart from a world where the United States and, in many ways, my country, the United Kingdom, are permanently at war. Permanently at war. And the United States has set up a prison where if an American was held there for 1 day under those circumstances, there would be outrage. But these are Muslim men held there, and it's 16 years. This is how many days 16 years is. 5,845. That's how long Guantanamo has been open today. And I'd like you, if you would, to think, how long would it take me to think of 5,845 different things? One for each of those days that this wretched place has been open. It's going to take you a very, very long time. It's such a huge amount of time. This is a poster campaign for the campaign that Tom and I set up on the 10th anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo 6 years ago. And this is one that we're running this year. I invite you, if you go to the closed Guantanamo website and are interested, take a photo with it, send it to us. We set up a Gitmo clock to go with it. It's counting, as we speak, how many days, hours, minutes, and seconds the prison has been open. And if you take if you print that, it will freeze exactly how much time has elapsed. And it's just part of a small gesture. We're all of us, trying through various ways. This submission, the lawsuit today, I hope, that at least gets media interest, that we can get talking about this again. But that's primarily, I think, what we need to do. I think we've spent a year being bamboozled. I think we've spent a year in distress, in unable to really work out how we can cope with such an ill-disciplined and crazy regime that we've all ended up waking up every morning going, what has he tweeted now? How do you take on that kind of government? But we need to find a way to get Guantanamo back on the radar and point out that it is as abominable now as it was the day it was opened 16 years ago. Thank you.
Well, I always feel, well, first of all, I apologize. I don't know. I have my hearing aids on in this thing. I can't turn it off for some reason. I wish there was something terribly profound to say. Let me say one thing in looking at Guantanamo, and then I just want to give some impressions I had, because I, with my colleague Kim Ferguson and Shelby made it in, Shelby Sullivan is from Reprieve. We're down there last week, and I haven't been down there in 5 years. So I want to give just some impressions of the absurdity of it. But let me say, and I forget, so there are 41 people there. The real story of Guantanamo, one story is the military commissions, how silly they are. But you've got to remember that's for the few people who ever been charged with any war crime. And the question there is, should they be tried in the United States or civilian court or in these silly military commissions? Military commissions haven't worked. But the real story of Guantanamo is not those people who have been charged. It's the people who are held without charge forever. I mean, in our system, you really shouldn't be imprisoned. It's a basic thing, unless you're charged with a crime and you can have a trial. To hold somebody without charge and without any ability to really test the basis for their imprisonment is so fundamentally wrong, so fundamentally against the Anglo-American system of justice. And Karen, I've got to say, to think that the new habeas petition might connect to people because it talks about sexual harassment or something, I don't know, no, but let me just say, I mean, those are terrible things, but what's happening at Guantanamo is so much fundamentally worse. That we can't connect on that is disgraceful to me. Now, let me just give some impressions. So I said, I haven't been down there forever. And, so I want to give visceral things. First of all, it's just so damn difficult to get there. We had a one-day meeting scheduled on Thursday of last week with our client, a new client for us, an old client for Shelby's. And by the way, what we're trying to do is change the system through this case so the laws will once again apply to Guantanamo, so we can reverse these Court of Appeals decision that's deprived everyone of a legal remedy and get it back on. But anyway, so to do that, getting down there, you need to schedule it way in advance. There were no planes, no commercial planes to go there. The military did have a plane that goes from Norfolk. It leaves at 6 a.m. and on Wednesday morning, 6 a.m. in the morning from Norfolk, and comes back, is supposed to come back then on Friday. Takes all day on Friday. So we had to go Tuesday night to Norfolk to get there to catch a 6 a.m. flight. On the way there, the three of us in our car and a taxi going to the military air base. As we get to the air base, they wouldn't let us in. Now, we had everything from the military up here of why we can get in, all the authorizations. And the guy at the other end of the phone at 5:15 or something said, well, you need to have an escort. I said, we don't need to have an escort. Honest to God. And then he starts talking in all this military gobbledygook. Well, you don't have an SMA, sutu-do, I said, what the hell is that? He said, sir, you're with the military. That's the way we talk. But they had no idea what they were talking about. Finally, thank God, at the last minute, some guy came on and he said, well, I'll let you in. I may get in trouble for it. But we almost missed our flight to get there. It's this military, arbitrary, inflexible rules. So we get in there, get on the plane, get there on Wednesday, spend Wednesday night, go over Thursday, meet with this guy, come back. Plane's supposed to come back Friday. The plane's canceled. So for a one-day meeting, it's a 4 or 5 day trip that you need to schedule before, just the difficulty of that. Then, as I said, the dealing with the military, changing rules that are absolutely arbitrary with absolutely inflexible people, it's maddening. Then you go to the base itself. I forgot the base. I mean, people, I don't know how many people here have been to Guantanamo. Well, you probably think of Guantanamo as a prison camp. Well, it's not. It's a big base. You know, it's 45 square miles. 45 square miles, a big thing with ferries and buses and all that. And you get this sense of a thing with the prison on the side. Kim said it very well. It's a little bit like a cheap tourist or, cruise ship. Because, they have their fake Irish bar there and other little things. I mean, there's an absurdity to the whole place that's crazy. And you're struck also by how extraordinarily expensive it is. You've got these military there, you've got facilities, you've got a water desalination plant or whatever it is, all these massive things, mess halls and all these things for these people going around it. And you say, why? Why is this place even there? Shelby told me that she has had conversations from people down there on all her recent trips, and they say, well, it's absolutely necessary for us, for protecting American security against what? Against Cuba. I mean, can you think that Cuba is a threat to the United States? We're a threat to Cuba, I'm sure they feel. But I mean, the absurdity of this, it costs billions of dollars to keep Guantanamo open. Then, I haven't talked about it this way before, but you get to the prison, which is, you need to cross the ferry and then you take a 10-minute car ride and you get to the prison, which is over the hills overlooking the sea, which would probably be beautiful. Trump might turn it into a hotel sometime, who knows. But, it's a prison built for, 770 people, which is largely empty now. But it has the same things as before, as I remember. You go in, huge fences with guard posts and everything, with razor wire all around it. You finally get in to see when you go through all these things, they check you in, they do all this, and you go into these little huts where they bring the prisoners to meet you with you. Very much the way it was, 14 years ago when I first went there and kept going on. The poor guy comes in here and he's still chained by his ankles to an iron ring in the floor. I haven't met this guy before. He's been there since May 2002, May 1st, 2002, the very day we first brought the first petition for habeas corpus on behalf of the Kuwaitis are there. So he's been there 15 and a half years, more than, or about half of his life. Why is he there? You know, it's classified, but I can tell in general, he's there because he attended or he stayed at places where they say Taliban stayed, Taliban or Al-Qaeda stayed. I mean, you know, I'm sure I've stayed at hotels where some bad people have been too, but this is really the evidence why he is there. Nice guy. When you talk about the human spirit, how people, their paintings, he is one who has had many paintings and some of the best. It's extraordinary to me, the resilience of the human spirit, because he still survives, he goes on, and he has hope. But you ask him what it's like, and I hope I'm not saying classified things, and if these fools think it's classified, let them try to prosecute me. But he said, you know, the difficulty of living here is living in a system, and think of what I confronted with the military trying to get on the plane. He said, it's the arbitrariness of the rules, the fact that there are no transparent rules, that they change all the time and they change at their own discretion. You know, so you can have one guard unit which allows you to have tweezers, and then the next guard unit comes up and they take it away. There's no reason. They change all the time and there's nothing you could do. So you're absolutely at the whim of these people. It's so much different and more difficult than being in a prison, in a real prison. First of all, in a prison, tough as it is, the rules are there and you know them. And you abide by them, and the guards need to abide by them. Now, maybe other prisoners don't, but that's not so here. And also, in a prison, even if it happens wrongly, you're convicted. You've had your day in court and you're convicted. These are guys who proclaim, I mean, our guy absolutely proclaims his innocence. He never did anything wrong. He was down there, he's caught in the wrong time. And he's there without reason, without an ability to test it. And you know, we said it on leaving, it's so absurd and disgraceful. This guy, if he admitted that he had done something wrong, if he admitted that he had provided material support to terrorism, he would have gone in 5 years in prison. He's been there 16 years. He would have been out of there by now. Andy said his son is 18. Over Christmas, I spent the Christmas with my grandkids. My oldest grandkid, I know you won't believe I could have grandkids, but that is 13. Her entire life, Guantanamo has been in existence. It can be there 30 years from now. The absurdity of this place is just terrible. What are we going to do about it? I don't know. It shows the failure of our democracy. You know, Obama, to my mind, and I'll say it, Obama was a total joke on this. He could have closed Guantanamo. He could have restored the rule of law there. He was afraid to do it because he didn't want to offend people in Congress. Trump's not going to do it because his base doesn't want to do it. How does our democracy deal with this issue? The way it's normally dealt with it is through the law. And the law has not applied at Guantanamo because the D.C. Circuit has taken it away. Our plan, with Shelby and Kim, is to restore the rule of law to Guantanamo so we don't need to count on useless politicians or public opinion, which doesn't give a damn about it. Well, as a matter of fact, when I get back, people say, why do you go there? Who cares about Guantanamo? Is it really still open? It's out of sight, out of mind. So, there, that's it.
That was great. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. So I want to pull us back a little bit from the focus on Guantanamo, which we'll return to. But Guantanamo is just one part of the larger American detention policy and the war on terror. And as you noted, it's one that has continued but has somewhat been stymied with the refusal to send anyone new to Guantanamo in recent years, despite Trump's claims that he was going to do it or wanted to. So I want to throw two questions to you about the broader detention policy. One is whether we're seeing an era where the U.S. is now refusing to detain people itself, and to what extent the United States is engaged in detention operations. And we've seen, and the second one is to what extent the United States' cooperation with partner organizations is posing its own threat of many of the very practices that worried people so much about Guantanamo, given who some of our partners are, and allegations of torture and long-term detention and atrocities beyond detention on the part of U.S. counterterrorism partners from East Africa and Syria and Iraq. And of relevance to this is that there's currently an American being held who the administration claims it can't bring to the U.S. to charge. Really, it won't bring to the U.S. to charge. And it's now, given the courts have said they can't continue to detain him without giving him some sort of legal aspect, are now seeking to transfer to a third-party country. So I'd like to throw that to all three of you to where do we stand outside of Guantanamo?
Well, let's just start with this last guy. This person who's been designated an enemy combatant was a designation that hasn't been used in that way for a long time. He's a dual citizen. I'm not sure he'd be transferred to a third country, but to his other country of citizenship. I think that's what it is. But what's interesting about that, if you go back in time to look at how individuals captured abroad have fared when this issue has come up, what to do with them. Hamdi was a dual citizenship, by mistake taken to, Yasser Hamdi, by mistake taken to Guantanamo early on, right? Dual Saudi-American, which is I think what this guy is, this new guy. And eventually, through a long series, moved from Guantanamo, then here to as an enemy combatant, and then eventually released because the courts didn't really want to deal with it. But now you have but John Walker Lind, who captured at the same time, held on the same ship, not brought to Guantanamo, brought into the federal system, not declared an enemy combatant, a U.S. citizen, not a dual national, is still in prison. So it's interesting how this issue of dual nationality, you're asking for larger questions, is going to play out. Also, your issue about are we going to detain? When President Obama gave his famous executive orders, when he first took office in those first couple days, he said we weren't going to torture anymore. He was going to find a way to close Guantanamo. But he also said that there was going to be a detention policy set up. And I've never been able to figure out, and I know people in Washington, maybe you will say that there's some kind of detention policy, but what is it? What we saw instead was running away from having to deal with what were just intractable political issues and the institutionalization of a way larger drone targeted killing program than we'd ever seen. And so what some people I think legitimately wrote was we had exchanged the complexities of the detention policy for a drone, a killing without due process. That's how some people wrote about it, and I think there is a relationship between these two things. Now, the White House has been talking about issuing an executive order on Guantanamo for quite some time, and then it just sort of stalled. Nothing happened. It never came out there, and it makes perfect sense to me. Why bother? I don't have to do anything. As Tom said, the rules can change any time. It's there as a black hole. Nobody really cares about it, so why stir up the water? So to my knowledge, we don't have a detention policy, as you've asked. I'm not sure it would look like, but I'm not sure that if we had one, it would be, I think it would be incredibly dissatisfying to at least the three of us sitting here. So we've just run away from this as a country, and Guantanamo is the symbol of our running away from it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about how the drone program largely replaced detention, which turned out to be very messy. I remember under Obama hearing about how in battlefield areas, people who were, or countries that the US was at war with, say Afghanistan, people who were captured who were foreign nationals were being sent back to those countries, but it was never a story that became a major story. It was never officially explained as to exactly what the policy was. I think, you know, it's a small area between things that's under discussion, because there is still bringing people to face trial in the United States has a long history of working. Throughout the whole Guantanamo period, that's what's happened. I think that for some of us, it's always been dubious, that first phase of capturing and moving somebody to bring them to justice in the United States, but at least there's a recognizable end destination. So I do wonder about exactly where they think they're going with this. And there's a very troubling story from the US about dual nationals, which I think may be relevant, which most people in Britain don't know, and I'm not sure how many people in the United States know, but it seems that when our current colossally incompetent Prime Minister, she shares the same adjectival words as the President of this country, colossally incompetent Theresa May, was the Home Secretary when she was a virulently racist Home Secretary. It seems that she, on a couple of occasions, found that there were dual national British citizens out in Syria who, completely extrajudicially, the intelligence people decided were terrorists. So she stripped them of their British nationality, told the Americans where they were, and then had them killed in drone attacks. It's kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, it really is shocking. And
I want to put a marker on this. I think the issue of citizenship, which is why I brought that up as part of something else I've been talking about in public, has been the issue of changing the notion of how you no longer have your citizenship.
Right,
is changing. And there is a very early memo from the John Walker Lynn case that was written by the Department of Justice early on about rethinking what it is, how you give up your citizenship, like de facto giving up of your citizenship.
Yeah, well, you start with dual nationals, and then you end up wanting to strip single national people of their nationality. And we should all watch out for that.
Well, let me say, as a legal matter, the issue of detentions is tough. And under the law, it's clear the way you can get away with a lot of things is if people don't have constitutional rights. If they have constitutional rights, U.S. constitutional rights, and that's what the whole debate has always been about, then you can't torture, you need to give them, you can't hold them without due process facing the charges and everything else. Okay. So if you're a U.S. citizen, you have U.S. constitutional rights. If you're a U.S. citizen even abroad, you have constitutional rights. If you're not a U.S. citizen, you have constitutional rights in the United States. The question has been, what constitutional rights do non-citizens have outside the United States? The Boumediene decision, which is the last one we won, said that at least in a place like Guantanamo, which is under the control of the United States, a non-citizen there has the right, at least a constitutional right, to habeas corpus. What that would mean is if somebody, and this worries people, if the U.S. had a plan before Guantanamo to get these little leased spaces around the world where they'd have total control but not have sovereignty, and there they could treat suspects without any constitutional rights. I think Boumediene changed that. They can't do that, so they do it undercover now. And if you do it in a place, let's say in a war zone where the United States really doesn't control the place, but you can do it, you probably have flexibility. But that's the legal problems that they deal with. So now they're doing it under the table. You know. Now our next, hopefully we can extend constitutional rights. All people should have the constitutional right not to be abused by U.S. officials wherever they are.
So one of the big changes in politics in the U.S. that surrounds the Trump victory is the collapse of a lot of different political categories that had previously defined our politics in terms of two parties. So I'm wondering, for the movement to close Guantanamo, how does that change the political field of who can be appealed to? Is the rise and dominance of Trump and people who were not traditionally at the fore of the Republican Party opening possibilities in different parts of the Republican Party for appeals to close Guantanamo? And similarly, in the Democratic Party, is closing Guantanamo going to become an issue where people close in around it, or will there be a continued tension where even within the Democratic Party, there's advocacy for keeping Guantanamo or not moving fast enough to close it?
Can I take the first cut at that?
Yep.
Please.
I think the problem is really not the Republican Party. I think the problem is that the Democrats, or at least the Democrats and old-time middle-of-the-road Republicans, who, when we grew up, really had, strong moral sense about what the United States stood for, have dropped back. So that Trump and Trumpism was empowered by the failure of the other side to articulate the clear principles for what this country stands and that are not tolerated to be violated. That this country doesn't stand for, smashing other people and being lousy and doing that. Now I get on my soap opera, but we are not a place. The United States is an ideal. It's an ideal of individual rights and liberty protected by the rule of law. And that's what we stand for, and that's what we're great about. I mean, Democrats and Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower stood very clearly for that. When people are afraid to articulate that and stand for that and fight for that, the other side of sort of racism and hatefulness and lies is empowered. That's what happened. We need the old type to stand up and tell people that they should be proud of being Americans, not because they're white, but because we have a principle that has been the hope of the world. So we aren't doing that. That's the problem.
So Tom and I discussed how not Trump himself or even elements of the administration, but that somehow the US establishment in some way might listen to criticism from other places. So what we did recently was that we spoke to MPs in the UK, and we got a cross-party group of MPs to write a letter to the government today calling for the prisoners approved for release to be released, calling for the prison to be closed. And we also, as Tom was pointing out, not just directing this at Trump, where I'm sure it just goes straight in the bin, but to send it to John McCain, who's the chair of the Armed Services Committee, because John McCain took an interest in the case of Shaka Armour several years ago when 4 British MPs came over in 2015 to call for his release. And the other guy is the head of which other Senate committee?
Corker.
Okay. So that's what the MPs have done today. They've also issued an early day motion in the British Parliament. But as far as I know, this is really the first time that it's starting to come back on the international radar. As I said earlier, I think we've all been in a fog for the last year, because trying to cope with what Trump and Bannon and all the terrible stuff that's been coming out all the time. A year ago when we were doing Guantanamo, we were between Obama and Trump, and nobody knew what to do about anything. This is the first year that we can say clearly, this is Donald Trump's Guantanamo. He owns it. And so we can start trying to find these ways to criticize him. So hopefully, we'll get more interest. I'm hoping that the European Parliament will want to get involved in trying to say something. Because if we remember back to the Bush days, a lot of this was how it started as well. A lot of it started with murmurings and then bigger movements among international allies to say, you can't do this, this isn't acceptable. And that's the problem of the domestic political situation here. I would not have any idea how to provide a solution to that, but I think there's been a failure of the leadership on the part of the Democrats. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The Democrats and some of the Bush people who contended at the time that they wanted to do it differently.
Right.
I would hold them to that, and I think they really do. This would be their moment.
Right.
So I think it could be both.
We need to help to identify them then.
Yeah, we know who they are.
So before we throw it out to you, 2 questions, I want to bring us back to this question of the future of citizenship and detention policy, and more broadly, how the idea of citizenship may be under assault these days. And I'd like to frame that with sort of two issue areas that relate to it. One is the extent to which the rise of groups like ISIS and the rise of a significant foreign fighter problem, which didn't exist before in the same way, maybe raising these detention challenges once again. But also, when the travel ban originally came out, how it initially tried, or seemed to at least, include people with green cards as part of it, which then got smacked down by the courts. So are we in an age where citizenship is itself under challenge, and citizenship and permanent residency connected to that as a particularly vulnerable step between citizens and those with no protections?
So I don't think it's citizenship that's under challenge. So, I mean, yes, the answer is yes, but I think it's a larger question of national identity. And I think that there's a lot of fluid identity issues in the world at large, and that there is a national identity issue here. And when Tom speaks about, the United States isn't a place, it's an idea and an ideal, this is up for play now. It's in discussion, and part of that is, what does it mean to be a citizen, and how are we defining citizen, and how are we cherishing open doors to other people becoming citizens? And I think it's all under discussion. And in a way, it's incredibly distasteful, but I think the only way to respond to it is to say, okay, you want to talk about it? We'll talk about it. Here are the ideals we think this country is about, and here's what we're willing to do to protect them, preserve them. I think one of the really problematic things in all of this is that those of us who are embracing the Constitution, fighting for it like these two gentlemen have been for so long, is that this is the old guard. They're the conservatives. Look at the Constitution. Look at what we have. Look at who we are. And yet there's this sense that we're in a new century, a new age, and that so much is in transition. And somehow we have to be bigger than we've been now in terms of our mental capacity, our intellectual capacity to deal with these very large issues of national identity, of maybe not being so rooted in the world as we saw it, but figuring out ways to make that world the bigger world for now. And I don't think we have the intellectual direction or anywhere for that, but I think that's what the challenge is.
We have some of the same problems in the UK as well. I think the United States and
the UK, you're a colonial empire. You're very different.
Well, you need to come and spend a bit more time.
Is that better or worse?
At the moment, Tom, because it's really not going well.
I don't think citizenship is under question. I think it'd be very difficult to do that. But I think Karen's right, a more subtle point. I mean, clearly, permanent residency, anyone who's not a citizen is under question. I think Karen's right. The real debate in the United States, which no one is articulating, I think Trump is very clearly articulating that it's a sort of xenophobic, racial complaint that the United States is an old thing and everybody else is intruding on it. And the idea of the United States as an idea or an ideal is under attack. And I was struck, even in the criticisms of the NFL and other athletes kneeling during the national anthem, which I think is a sign of respect. But the criticisms of them, I was struck, and I tried to get it published as an op-ed and nobody cared, but in 1943, Justice Jackson, who was just on the court at 44, wrote a terrific opinion. There was a law passed, I can't remember the state, I wish requiring teachers and citizens to pledge allegiance to the flag. And some people religiously said, no, we're not going to do that, and went up and First, everybody said, well, they got to, it's fair and everything. And Jackson wrote just a brilliant opinion about the strength of the United States was the diversity of opinions, and that we are really not threatened by different people. I mean, here's what we stand for. And it was so well articulated. Nobody has said that today. I don't know what's happened to us. I really seem like an old guy losing it, but when I was a kid, we had a firmer sense of that we were different. You can have a good economy in Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy, but the country's about more than a good economy. It's about believing in certain ideals, and nobody stands up for them now. They're afraid to, and that's why I say the real problem is the Democrats. And I thought Obama at the end was lousy about it, standing up and bringing people together patriotically about what we stand for and why we're different. And I think that is the debate now. And it's not, the other side is not there.
I think on just one of the things you mentioned, which is the travel ban on mainly Muslim countries, which I thought was so appalling. And I think the Trump administration did find out that actually a lot of courts thought so as well, and there has been a push back against that, which I really hope in the end will be successful, because there's something so profoundly shameful about having a president who decides that he's going to ban everybody from a country. That very notion that you're not letting anyone in, that's the kind of, we had that at Guantanamo when none of the Yemenis got released, which happened for years and years and years and years. It's the most difficult place for them to get sent back to. None of them do get sent back there. Actually, now they had to find other countries for them. But at that time, quite a lot of us working on Guantanamo called it guilt by nationality. That was how it worked in Guantanamo. And to have as a national policy this kind of travel ban, I just have found so appalling, and I really hope that the courts persist in challenging it and actually bringing it down.
Well, thanks. We'll take questions now. We have a mic that will come to you. It should be a question, not a comment, so also keep it short, and it should end with the question mark. Let's start right up in the front.
Is the fact that a prisoner, even with medical problems, cannot come to the United States for care a law passed by Congress and signed by the President?
Sorry, and let's also, can you all identify?
I'm Jim Kolbe. I'm a surgeon. So the question is the fact that a patient who needs medical care can't come to the U.S. for that care, is that a law passed by Congress and signed by the President?
No. And let me just say, Jim Kolbe went to high school with me, although he's much older than I. And I'm so impressed because he's a well-known surgeon who has devoted the last 6, 7, or 8 years of his life to human rights causes. And you, Jim, just to tell the story, because he told me before, there's a Guantanamo prisoner who's been suffering from terrible back problems, needs surgery. They won't take him to Miami. So Jim consults with them from here. They take him on our machines down there, and he's operated on then in Guantanamo badly and improperly. And Jim say, why can't he come to Miami? It's not a law. It's because he has no rights. And the military is in charge of him, and they said we're not letting him out anywhere. And they're afraid, by the way, if he comes to the United States, that some lawyer like I will say he's got rights now, so give him rights. So they want to keep him out of the United States, and it's military bureaucracy, too. He's not allowed. So I should have said, last thing, when we got out from seeing our client last week, this little nice guy who had been on hunger strike, is down 50% in his weight, outside waiting to take him back were 6 military guys in battle gear with plastic masks and everything. I said, the absurdity of this. But that's it. It's the same thing. They're not letting them out. Not a law. It's the military.
Let's do right next. Right next to him.
So my name is Todd Pierce. I'm a retired Army JAG officer. I represented 3 Guantanamo prisoners, actually, so I've got a lot of firsthand experience both with Guantanamo, but also with the military mind, how the military thinks of things, and with a lot of research into the law of war, which is a separate sphere of the rule of law, as you guys no doubt are aware. And as the Supreme Court has routinely said, regarding martial law, et cetera, in Hawaii and Japanese-American removal, is that martial law is merely the arbitrary will of the military commander. And I think, if I may, trying to make this short, but what we have failed to do, and why, with all respect to Karen and Andy, you only have mentioned symptoms, but the deeper problem is the extreme deference that we have given to the military ever since 2001, to where, Trump is an odious man, of course, but he's got the generals around him, and the military overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump. He's not an outlier with the military. He represents that militaristic viewpoint. Back in the 40s, the United States took it more seriously.
Let's get their
I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Question of
But I haven't heard
deference.
anybody mention the war. Now, you don't have to mention that we're losing the global war on terror, which we are. All you have to do is look at a situation map of today in 2001. But walking in here, New America, they published books like The Generals by Thomas Ricks, celebrating Petraeus, and as Ricks readily conceded when challenged, it was a failure. The surge was a failure. But yet there's a cottage industry built upon celebrating the military, the militaristic values, the warrior, et cetera. And my question, I guess, is perhaps we need to look deeper and get beyond the symptoms and beyond the guy who just happens to be a very repulsive man in office today, and look at how the system itself, how the psychology under this constant threat of perpetual war, or what we see as a threat, has changed the American people to where we turn to the military and demand that they protect us and put aside constitutional rights in favor of the law of war, et cetera. So perhaps you can comment on how we actually stop collaborating with the militarists and perhaps work at rejecting their worldview so that we can get back to constitutional rights and international law.
Sure. So let's get the thoughts on deference and militarism more broadly.
And Todd, listen, Todd is one of the guys from the military who stood up and had a firm sense of right and wrong in all this. And it's an interesting thing because, as you know, some of our greatest allies in this battle were military guys. Admiral John Hudson, Don Guter, a number of four-star Army generals who just said, this is what we stand for, this is wrong. And Mattis stood up, did he not, on torture? Well, but so... Well, no, but I mean, so there was a sense... Yeah, I mean, I would like to see... one of the fascinating stories when we were kids and McCarthyism was going on, the guy who really brought down McCarthy was Dwight Eisenhower. He said, this is just so fundamentally against what I stand for as an American. I remember it was interesting, even, what happened, Orrin Hatch, who I'm not that fond of all that, said, during the Charlottesville thing, you remember during the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis, so Trump wasn't condemning them, and Hatch said, I fought against Nazis. I'm not going to tolerate them here. But we need more of that education. I don't know what we do, but it's a good point. I've been always confused about it because I see some good people and some crazy people. Can I say one more thing about that? Got to remember, what really happened, the real guys who caused the torture and everything weren't the military guys. It was people in the White House. It was right-wing people in the White House, Addington and Gonzalez, who didn't look at it. They were the ones who reversed, the torture policy. Who wrote things, justifying torture, which even the dumbest first-year law student would have said, oh my God, nobody could write that. They did it. It wasn't so.
I think we'll take a...
But they were the minority. The routine officers, believe me, I rub elbows with them, I know. They're fully in favor of torture. They're fully in favor of all these things. So when we pick out a few people who stood on principle, we're missing the bigger picture.
So I think we'll take
I want to add one thing.
Oh, sure.
I hear all of that, and you know that I wrote a book on how the military, the better military, was taken over by Rumsfeld during the first 100 days of Guantanamo. But I think something else. I think it's a bigger thing again. I think the distinction between military and civilian is being erased on a lot of fronts. I think the distinction between war and crime, like why aren't we talking about war, has been erased on a lot of fronts. I think the distinction between guilt and innocence has been erased on a lot of fronts, all initially in the name of the war on terror. Now I see it in a lot of other places. So I take your point, but as a beginning point to, I think, it's a different discussion that I think we need to start having.
I also, if I could just say, Todd, I mean, I think any in-depth analysis of Guantanamo and the war on terror leads to fundamental questions about the basis under which those wars were undertaken militarily. So, simple things like soldiers going out to the battlefield and wondering why they didn't have the Geneva Conventions hanging up on the wall because Rumsfeld had told them that didn't apply anymore. Simple things like competent tribunals, the battlefield tribunals, to assess whether the guy who said he was a farmer is a farmer or not. The civilians who are caught up in the fog of war, who traditionally you hold a tribunal as near to the place and time of capture as you can. They're allowed to call witnesses so that you can not take to your military prison the civilians who were caught up in wartime. They expected that when they went to Afghanistan in 2001. Guess what? That got done away with as well.
By the White House.
And that was huge. I mean, the United States had done this in the Gulf War in Iraq in 1991, and the figures of those people were that it was something like 2/3 of the people they shouldn't have sent to prison, so that they let them go. But with Guantanamo, they had none of that screening. But you see other problems as well. What you see with any kind of study of the Guantanamo stories, hang on a minute, they went into Afghanistan, they didn't know who any of the players were in Afghanistan. They start cutting deals with dodgy warlords, and then people that they're cutting deals with are ending up sending people to Guantanamo because these people are using the Americans to get rid of their local rivals. You know what I mean, Todd? At every level that you start analyzing the story of why the detention is such a fiasco in the war on terror and why Guantanamo is such a disgraceful place is because of all these errors, none of which reflect well on the way that the military is operated.
So, thanks, but we have a bunch of people. Let's get into the back.
It was civilians who did that.
Thank you. My name is Maha Hilal, and I just have a couple of questions. One, I've been to many Guantanamo panels, discussions, talks, etc., and it seems that the role of Islamophobia is often decentered in much of these discussions. So we're not talking about a prison for white Christians. We're talking about a prison for non-white Muslims. So I'm curious to hear more about, the strategy of incorporating this system of oppression. And secondly, when I think about the questions that were posed about citizenship, I'm a Muslim American, and I can tell you I very much fear that my citizenship could be revoked. Maybe it's not a realistic fear, but given what just happened with the citizen who's been detained in Iraq, the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki in 2010, I think we have to think about, when we're talking about questions of national identity, this administration in particular is crafting a white supremacist national identity. So I think we really need to talk about, what is this national identity? How does it correspond to white supremacy? And what are the policies that are doing it? And just to add on that point, 3 South Asians were recently stripped of their citizenship in the last couple days. They were naturalized citizens. So it's clear that there is a very distinct concept of national identity and citizenship that the Trump administration is promoting.
Of course, these people were held by the Bush administration too, and the Obama administration. So I wouldn't, I think the problem is, I don't think the policy was adopted to be anti-Muslim. I think it's because these people are Muslims from other countries, they don't have a base in a democracy that's failed to advocate on their behalf. It's without cost to the politicians who do it, and there's not enough in it for the weak politicians who won't stand up on their behalf. So it's the worst problem of being a minority without political voice or power. Now with Trump, it might have shifted to be an anti-Muslim bias. With the others, It just happened and nobody cared because they were Muslims, is really the way I see it.
I mean, I absolutely know what you're saying, Mahat, and I frequently have pointed out to get audiences to understand that. Can you imagine if Guantanamo was full of Christians or Jewish people? Can you imagine the outrage? And it follows on from that when people get that, then they understand that there's an Islamophobic agenda, and that's indicative of some serious problems with racism and Islam that we have in our countries. I mean, this is in Britain as well. It wasn't originally why Guantanamo was set up. It's just that, because they were going to capture Muslims, and then when they did capture Muslims, it suddenly turns out that racism rears its ugly head in a particularly horrible way. Your issues about national identity, I absolutely sympathize with you, and I really hope that people, whatever their background, are going to keep fighting on this, because, that was really my point of throwing in that stripping the dual nationality anecdote from the UK, from the woman who now pretends to be our Prime Minister, who has extrajudicially facilitated the assassination of people who were joint British nationals. And I think everybody needs to worry. And I think those of us who, my family appears to be British going back as long as I know. And I'm not a dual national in Britain. There's no other country that anybody who didn't like me could say, why is he here and why are we not sending him back there? But I think the obligation on all of us is to think about what's happening to people who have been put in a more vulnerable position by governments that are veering towards very, very dangerous racism.
One little detail, it's not such a detail, but just one little thing you might want to think about is that it's even more pernicious in a way than you've identified, because one of the reasons that the racism becomes part of the national security state and the elements of it is this perpetual idea that we don't know who's attacking us, we don't really know who it is, we don't know why, how can we profile, we can't profile. So instead, and Guantanamo is very much this too, 800 people, of which 700 and more had to be let out because they were the wrong guys. This idea that more is better, and that find the biggest category you can find, whether it's in surveillance or initially in the way the targeted killing's done or in detention, is to me a sign of a lack of confidence in our ability to know who actually wants to hurt us and why. And so I think it's a problem with some deep philosophical issues as well as the more visceral ones you've identified.
One more time. It's more, the idea, which happens in Trump, and people aren't standing up for it, is that they're not us. And the us is a white group of people. They're not us. We don't want them in the country, don't know who they are. And people need to understand, as I say, us isn't a certain people or a place. It's a concept. So when someone who's a citizen is a Muslim or not, and they can all be us. It's a xenophobic racial fear.
Let's get into the middle here.
Thank you. My name is Ilhan Kagri, and I want to thank you personally for the work that you do. My question is about this idea of no one cares. So does the media not have any responsibility at all? I mean, it seems to me that caring is manufactured. And the more we talk about something, the more the media talks about it, the more people start caring about it. And I think that the media is complicit in making sure that we don't care about certain things and that we do care about other things. And I'm not thinking about Fox News, but I am thinking about supposedly more responsible media outlets. And in addition to that, it would take in this whole idea of who our enemies are. So in fact, it's true that 50% of Americans think they're going to be killed in a terrorist attack, when the possibility of that is so small compared to what the FBI statistics say, which is that in right-wing white supremacist extremism, violent extremism is actually a problem in this country, and we don't talk about that. And people don't think about that because, again, the media is not doing its job in correcting our misperceptions and getting us to think about things in a different way. So could you
I
talk?
think that's such a great question, and but it's something that particularly annoys me, because I think that the right-wing media doesn't have any problem with pumping out hate relentlessly day after day to brainwash people into thinking what they want them to think. And the liberal media, the establishment left media, does not do that.
Right.
And I think that they're failing to understand where the battlefield is in terms of how people think. And I think one of the things that we can see with Trump's America is that failure. One of the things that we can see with Brexit Britain is that failure. Now, I remember when the Iraq war started, the Daily Mirror newspaper, which at the time was edited by a man who I don't generally have much time for, called Piers Morgan, who eventually, I have to say, sadly, faked some pictures of detainee abuse in Iraq and was sacked. But before that happened, what he did, which I thought was remarkable, was that for the first few months of the illegal invasion of Iraq, he published a WMD-ometer on the front page of the Daily Mirror, which every day said, these are how many days it is that the WMD that we went into Iraq for haven't been found. That's the kind of campaigning that I think that we should see on the left. I don't see why there isn't a clock on the top of one of the main newspapers in this country telling every American citizen how long Guantanamo has been open.
I think the question you raise is why we don't care, really. I think it's wrong to blame it on the media, in part because the media is not going to change that. The media reports what's going on. And, Trump has been terribly successful in being so crazy that it's hard for the media to stay away from everything he says every day, that other things get lost and they're going to be reported. I really think the failure is more, and it's not for the media to do campaigns. I mean, Fox News does it, but and maybe somebody else does it. But good media should report and go on and have good commentary. I think it's more the fault of lack of political leadership. I really do. We don't have, what politicians has talked about Guantanamo? Who do they care? Who's talked about other things? They don't. I mean, so.
Yeah, there's also no entertainment. I mean, I don't mean entertainment like it's entertaining, but the amount of Hulu series that are about Al-Qaeda, that are about, wait till you see what's coming out this spring in terms of what caused 9/11, who caused 9/11, what happened. Where's Guantanamo story? No, we've seen so many pieces of this war on terror dramatized, not Guantanamo. So I don't know if that's media, but there's a lack of wanting to tell this story to the larger public. I don't know.
Let's get up front.
I'm Dave Casper. I'm a filmmaker, and I've been following the whole torture issue for all these years, and it sort of baffles me that the people who did this, who authorized it, the people who carried it out, there's no question that what they did is illegal. It's domestic law, international law. These are crimes, serious crimes. And how is it that these laws are not enforced? How is it that they've gotten totally away from it, totally off without any accountability? And is this likely to ever change?
There is one sentence answer to that, which is what President Obama said the week before he took office, which was about looking forward and not back. But on the other hand, I think that what the American people need to be proud of to some extent is that the Senate's Intelligence Committee spent 4 years investigating the CIA's torture program and produced a report. Now, I think it's very sad that we haven't seen the unredacted but full version of the report, and that all we got was a redacted executive summary. But that was around 500 pages. There was a lot of devastating information in there, and actually the conclusions of that report, showing how brutal it was, how it exceeded even the lines that had been set, how the CIA lied repeatedly about its success. Absolutely damning. I have to say there is not this, for a single moment could I imagine that happening in the UK.
Well,
We have from the top a situation of almost complete secrecy over anything that they don't want anyone to know about.
Yep.
This was something to do with checks and balances that certainly still exist in some way. And what worries me that I've been talking about just the last few days is the continuing privatization of elements of the military and the intelligence, because of course they're not going to be accountable to anybody under any basis. But I think, I think that report went a certain way, but where it left it was in a territory that was more like a truth and reconciliation process of like, we've aired in public what we did wrong. We know that the people who did it have told us they won't do it again. And in fact, you saw that when Trump said, let's bring back torture. Who didn't jump on him and say, don't be an idiot?
Who didn't jump on it? Let me tell you, the majority of American people today believe, no, and Andy, I take issue with this. Your question is, Dianne Feinstein released this report, didn't matter a damn. I mean, she did a great, courageous thing. But let me tell you, it's an extraordinary thing. The majority of American people today believe in torture. Now, partly, I mean, I'd like to see a filmmaker. I have not seen a seminar out here that says, does torture work? Is it right? Have we ever examined this? No, we have people yelling back and forth, but somebody should do it. I'd like a film on it. I mean, it's a terrible thing that when we grew up, remember the guys who did the torture? They were the North Koreans and everything. We would never touch it. Now, this country believes in torture. And the release of that report meant nothing except courage by Dianne Feinstein. And people weren't held accountable, and they should have been. Can they in the future? I don't know. These were gross crimes against humanity. And it was really right in the White House. David Addington, they purposely, John Yoo, who's now a professor at Berkeley or Stanford, purposely misinterpreted the law to allow torture. And this country has never come to account for it. And those people are heroes to a whole group of people.
And Obama didn't allow anybody to be held accountable, of course, because the investigation into you and Bybee, which was going to conclude that they were guilty of professional misconduct, was allowed to be watered down. So, I don't disagree that someone should be held accountable, and I think that remains an objective.
No, but you're a filmmaker? Let me tell you, I think films can have more of an impact than reporters and the media and everything. And I'd like to see some good films on this that can talk about this poor kid who was there. I mean, Slahi's book, My Guantanamo Diary, is going to come out in a movie, and maybe it will catch on to this. So people need to relate to what's wrong. One of the best movies I saw in Guantanamo is one that Andy did almost 10 years ago. It was a wonderful movie, interviewing a detainee at the end, and you felt the horror of what it was like to be caught up in a regime of torture and lawlessness. But if people can feel some of those things and see them, it would make a difference, not just news stories and everything, and not talking heads, but a visual where you can relate to people.
One depressing January visit a few years ago, though, was, guess what was opening? Cinemas across the country, Zero Dark 30. How much damage did that do?
Yeah.
So
don't go and see any films by Catherine Bigelow, by the way. I think that would be an effective kind of boycott, really.
So we have to wrap up the event, but first I'd like to just get a yes or no from all three of you on what I think are two important questions looking forward. The first is, do you think there's any chance that Guantanamo will close in the next 4 years or 8 years if Trump is reelected? And the second is, if in the future, if there's a presidency that is more willing to close Guantanamo or willing to make steps towards closing it, are we at the point where you think there's political will to deal with the set of prisoners who have been termed the forever prisoners and who are not among those who have been considered or even cleared for release, but have historically been separated off as ones, many of them we do know were part of Al-Qaeda? Are we set to get to a point where we can release them and not hold them forever or put them through a civilian process?
I don't know. I've always thought that there's a, that when we get to when the numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller, we get to some very difficult issues about what do you do with Abu Zubaydah, who's stateless? Really? But, we're still not there. And at the moment, we're still dealing, which nobody seems to know or care about, with a guy that Tom went to see who's only held because he hasn't behaved well in U.S. custody. This is not about what he did before he ended up in U.S. custody. There's a prisoner at Guantanamo who isn't even who they think he is. They have a photo of him, and it's not him. They've called him a forever prisoner, and they don't know who he is.
So,
how can this still be happening?
Well, let me step for your two questions, though, because they come back. I think if we could restore if our case works and we restore the law there, maybe we can close it, okay? But otherwise, no, in 4 years. 8 years, I don't want to contemplate Trump being reelected. But the only thing and the other thing, you're assuming, and what Andy said is really relevant, a lot of these forever prisoners, they're not held because they know they were Al-Qaeda or anything. It's because they've misbehaved at Guantanamo, or because, these are people who they do not have proof to bring to trial. And it's not because, they know they did it because they admitted under torture.
Also, they've done 16 years now,
yeah,
so
no,
what would
yeah,
they have got if they'd had a trial?
Yeah, so it's not, don't think there are people who are Al-Qaeda there and we just can't try them. It's bullshit. It's a legal term. But, so yes, I think we've got to have somebody who has the guts to do it. And if they want to try other people, let them try it.
I think it's like we're back in some ways in the early days of the Bush administration, that we have to work out that it's us that has to fight our own government, you in the United States, to keep finding ways to say yet again, in a big way, this is wrong. And it needs foreign intervention as well. It needs other countries to say to the United States what you're doing is wrong. Karen, please.
Well, I'm always the person who has hope. I think it's going to take some deft political leadership, but I think it could happen. It's not such a big deal. The realities of the things that threaten this country are so far off the mark from what's housed at Guantanamo that it is not even a non-starter, and that somebody will try and release these guys and it'll be over. But that's because I am constitutionally incapable of thinking the other.
well, with that, thanks to our speakers.